skill drain complaints are funny to me. There's Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks that literally lock you out of doing anything if you go to second, but skill drain is the problem. Skill drain. A card that's killed off by anything from Twin Twisters to MST, etc.
This tweet sucks. With Master Duel taking off, a lot of nostalgic players are beginning to rediscover their passion for the game, which is great. However, they can tend to make certain claims that come from places of ignorance and misunderstanding. So we're going to be dunking on every shitter on Twitter about their brave idea of floodgates and why every argument in favor of their existence is hot trash. Let's get started. Keeping combo in check. One of the primary arguments for floodgates is that it quote-unquote keeps the meta in check. Well, let me ask you a question. What happens when the meta decks start playing a floodgate? Decks like Spiral playing Mystic Mine, Dragon Link playing the Buster Lock, Zodiac playing Dimensional Barrier, Geargia playing Shockmaster. These are all historically combo-based decks that, in their era, played uninteractive, not fun floodgates because of how powerful and generic they were. Cards like Skill Drain don't fulfill the same exact slot that more flexible floodgates provide, such as the ones mentioned above, but they all do fulfill the same purpose of not interacting with your opponent and shutting out decks options. The same could be said about monster-based floodgates, such as VFD, Apollousa, and Herald of Ultimateness. These are all extremely oppressive cards that also shut down players' plays, but whenever I see these two camps of monster floodgates versus trap floodgates arguing with each other on Twitter, it really gets frustrating to me for why they both can't just agree that, hey, maybe these cards and design thematics are just very silly overall.
Powerful conventional discourse of a classic power transition from the US to China could have profound practical implications for this important relationship.
You can play outs to it, which there are a ton of. Yes, MST, Harpy's Feather Duster, and Lightning Storm do all exist as very powerful outs to floodgates and back row. However, let's take some deck building math into account. Let's say that in theory you're playing 6 normal summons, which is the statistical norm in most decks, and are maining 3 forms of back row removal. Statistically, in a 40 card deck and a 6 card hand, because you're going second, you are likely going to open a starter as well as a way to deal with back row about 24% of the time rounded up. Those aren't very good odds. Obviously, you could increase your starter count, but that would also decrease the overall odds in seeing a back row out. You could increase your back row out count, but that would overall decrease your deck's overall consistency. It's these sort of trade-offs where deck building really takes a toll in asking the question of, am I prepared to out this floodgate for the cost of overall consistency, or am I just going to flat out lose to it if they do happen to sack into it? Master Duel is a best of 1 format, which, although has its own issues, also comes with the issue that decks built around high rolling with back row exist just as much as decks high rolling with combo. There is no side deck to hard counter these decks games 2 and 3, and this forces people to use their 9 to 15 remaining main deck slots on cards such as hand traps or board breakers, and when you realize that the math splits itself down the middle of high ladder being about half combo and half control nonsense, you realistically cannot counter both. Main for combo, lose to control. Main for control, lose to combo. Additionally, you could offer the solution of playing a deck which has a small engine, such as Invoked or Striker, in order to be able to play more board breakers and outs. However, this comes with the caveat that these decks overall are pretty weak, not because they can't shit out a 30 negate board or set 20 pass, but because their power ceilings are too low as a result of their small engines, and because of these small engines additionally, are a little too inconsistent. Sure, you can break the board, but if you're not following it up with anything meaningful, you're going to get OTK'd on the crackback very easily. And additionally, even if you do draw the out, what if your opponent drew the out to your out? What if your opponent has a Golden Land Forever for your MST? What if they chain Judgment to your Feather Duster? Have you considered the odds in a universe where you are maining Red Reboot, a card at 1, and opening a combination of a starter, back row disruptor, and the Red Reboot are about 3% rounded up? Remember, your opponent, in all likelihood, has outs to your outs as well. So no, the idea of just drawing the out isn't very helpful in any capacity. Floodgates don't advance the game state, and you need a real win con. This is false for the reason that control decks playing floodgates, such as Subterra and Eldritch, do not want the game state to progress. They are purposely slowing it down as much as possible because their turn-to-turn plays, while extremely slow and weak in general relatively to many combo decks, are simply better than those reliant on decks with combos while under a floodgate. When you really think about it, the only way Eldritch pushes for damage is by summoning a 2500 vanilla beater. However, most decks do not have a way to summon their own larger monsters without having to commit to some type of effect or summon, one of which is going to be negated due to floodgates, and as a result, the 2500 beater protecting the floodgate is the win con, which again is possible thanks to cards such as Golden Land and Forever and Judgment. Floodgates create a game state which is balanced for both players. This would be an argument in favor of floodgates if both players were only playing control-based mirror matches, say Eldritch vs Paleo or Skill Drain Beatdown vs Goat Control. However, that isn't how matchups work in Yu-Gi-Oh! In the long run and in reality. Over the course of dozens of games, the odds you are playing this sort of mirror match are at absolute best 50%. And in a fantasy world where top ladder is split into solely Eldritch versus Drytron, additionally, you have to consider the fact that, again, other floodgates exist that combo players can play, which, say in a pure Sword Soul Mirror, a card like Royal Decree can create a balanced game state, being that both players are unable to rely on, say, their Sword Soul blackouts. But against Eldritch, it's a game ender. We wouldn't need floodgates if combo decks weren't as uninteractive as they are. This, to an extent, is true. It is a prevailing theory that floodgates only see heavy usage and are great in formats where combo exists heavily. However, I'd like to counter the argument with the fact that even in control and mid-range formats, floodgates were still used. Again, look at Toss format where Thunder Dragon Colossus was an incredibly powerful floodgate that was played, not just because the deck was playable, but because the floodgate was good enough against most of the top decks. Look at even Last format, a format that had a ton of back and forth gameplay and interaction, where people still played cards like Tikaboo and Striker, Protoss and Sword Soul, and Mystic Mine in just about everything. Yes, floodgates do see significant play in regards to shutting out silly combo decks, but they also hurt control and mid-range decks. Floodgates are the only viable way to make a budget deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! While it is true that many budget options do exist within Yu-Gi-Oh! That revolve around floodgates, such as True Draco, Eldritch, and Shaddoll Invoked being some of the only viable competitive decks that players on a budget can afford while playing in paper, there are also other affordable decks that are playable and do not rely on floodgates. Decks such as Lunalight, Dinosaur, and Unchained are all extremely cheap and affordable decks that are able to play at the locals and regional level extremely well that do not rely on floodgates as their own win con. Floodgates are an easy way for decks that aren't good to become significantly better.
No, please,
Let's have it.
You don't understand. Please, this is all I have. I'm nothing without this.
Floodgate.
If you're nothing without this,
Floodgate.
then you shouldn't have it.
I want to reiterate this point from Patrick Hoban, one of the greatest players of all time, who during an interview talks about his perspective on pseudo and actual floodgates.
I'm on the border with Appaloosa and how I feel about it from like a game design perspective. It's a bit of a floodgate, you know. So I'm not a huge fan of floodgates in general. I kind of just think the game would be better without them as a whole. And even if they weren't being played, like I would go down the list and ban them all, right? But you know, that being said, Appaloosa is like a border card because it's like I actually don't like cards where you don't have a way to beat them in your engine. Like if you have to draw a card, you know, like Dark Ruler or Droplets, right? To beat a card, I don't like cards like that from a game perspective. But if you can beat it in some kind of way with your engine cards, then I think it's fine from a game design perspective. And I think Appaloosa is like very much on the border of those two things.
I find a lot of agreement with this sort of sentiment. I personally really dislike cards that are oppressive enough to swing entire metagames and force people to deck build differently and be forced to quote-unquote draw the out. Cards like VFD, Skill Drain, etc. These are all extremely unintuitive and unfun cards that I feel like the game would be much healthier and more fun without. And that's it. Every defense for floodgates logistically and statistically broken down. I sure hope Rhyme Style doesn't block me on Twitter for this. Anyways, let me know what you guys think about floodgates in the comment section down below. Like and subscribe. That's it for me. See ya.